I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Russia's state TV propagandists and government officials express delight at Donald Trump's cabinet selections, we ask how feasible it would be for Ukraine to develop its own nuclear weapon.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 14th of November, 2 years and 270 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate comment editor Francis Dearnley, nuclear, biological and chemical warfare expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, and the Telegraph's director of audio and presenter on the Daily Tea podcast, Kamal Ahmed. I started with the latest news from the battlefield. Ukrainian air defences shot down 21 of 59 drones launched by Russia overnight, whilst 38 others were lost across Ukraine, the Air Force said. Civilians were killed and injured in Donetsk Oblast. Governor Vadim Falashkin reported from there. Other injuries were caused in Sumy, Kharkiv and Kherson Oblasts. Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Poltava, Luhansk, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia Oblasts were also attacked, but no casualties reported from those areas. Now let's zoom into the northeast of the country, around Kupiansk. We've been talking about it for a few days now. Ukrainian forces say they successfully repelled Russian attempts to break into the city of Kupiansk. It's in Kharkiv Oblast. This comes from Ukrinform. That's Ukraine's state national news agency. They're reporting that this morning, citing the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. A spokesperson for the General Staff, Andrei Kovalev, said all Russian attacks in this direction were successfully repelled. Russian invaders failed to enter Kupiansk. The city is under the control of Ukraine's armed forces. Okay, but still not great that they're having to put out statements like this, is it? The statement comes after the crowdsourced monitoring website Deep State said last night that some Russian units, including armoured vehicles and at least one tank, managed to enter Kupiansk but then suffered heavy losses. Deep State's map today, if you have a look at it, shows Russian forces continue to press the town, closing in particular from the north. So I said yesterday that Russian forces are in almost like a pincer movement, but they're about 5 Ks from the north of the city, 15 to 20-ish Ks to the south. That northern effort it seems to be having more success. Now, Mr. Kovalev said Russian forces attempted to break through Ukrainian defences in the area yesterday afternoon, attacking in 4 waves with 15 vehicles, including tanks and armoured fighting vehicles. So, difference between an armoured fighting vehicle and an armoured personnel carrier. Generally, an armoured personnel carrier, think of it as a battle taxi, just to get the troops into the fight. An armoured fighting vehicle, sometimes called an infantry fighting vehicle, can actually fight itself. So it's generally got a great big gun. It'll probably have some kind of anti-tank missile, guided missile as well, maybe some air defence stuff. And it could, with the kit that they're using, almost certainly does have room for troops in the back as well. So an armoured fighting vehicle is more than a battle taxi, basically. But Mr. Kovalev says Ukrainian defenders destroyed all Russian armoured vehicles and a significant part of manpower. Now, he continued, making a very serious allegation if it's true. Mr. Kovalev said that Russian troops were wearing Ukrainian uniforms, which is against the international rules of warfare. Perfidy, trying to pretend that you are something you're not, in the bracket of hiding under recognised symbols such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and that kind of thing. Now, Russian troops have ramped up their efforts near Kupiansk from early September. We think they're only about 2 or 3 kilometres from the city's industrial outskirts in the northeast, so like I say 5-ish Ks from the city centre. Kyiv Independent assessed that Moscow's forces are trying to reach the Oskil River. That divides the city in 2, running north-south, trying to get to the river before winter sets in. Now, that river, the Oskil River, Russia has reached that in much smaller numbers, about 20 Ks south of Kupiansk, as I've said. That is a formidable natural obstacle. All rivers can be a pain in the bum, but this one around this area of northeast Ukraine is very, very wide, hundreds of metres wide in places. The very significant obstacle to movement runs for about 40 kilometres in this part of the country. So Russia is able to push west up to the bank of the Oskil River, including through the city of Kupiansk, it makes it very, very difficult for the Ukrainian forces, if they've had to withdraw to the other side, to get back. Now, elsewhere, Russian forces continue pushing west on the northern and the southern sides of the Vovcha reservoir in the Donbass, but it's at minimal movement down there. The reservoir is about 5 k's long, and they're still only a few hundred metres from the eastern end. I mention it because there has been movement, so I don't want you to think that there's nothing at all happening there. It's still extremely violent, but not a lot of change in the lines. Just finally for me, only because it's doing the rounds, you'll hear this, there is footage and reports of a British Challenger 2 tank in service with the Ukrainian armed forces being hit by a Russian drone. It's being shared by pro-Russian bloggers. Some attach the descriptor that the tank was destroyed. I mean, that's not what the footage shows. So what do we think happened? Russian Marines from the 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade are said to have destroyed the vehicle during fighting in Russia's Kursk region. That comes from the prominent pro-Kremlin Telegram channel Rybar. Now, unless they've got other footage that I've not seen, but we are citing, it's on our website, you'll find it, the footage that's done all the rounds, it's out on social media, it's in other news outlets. It certainly does not show a tank being destroyed. You see the image from what we're told is a first-person view drone. It is a Challenger 2 tank, unless it's a brilliant disguise, but I'm pretty certain it is a Challenger 2. We don't know where or when the footage was taken. This FPV drone hovers around for a bit and then flies into the turret. The tank is in a tree line, so not brilliantly well sighted, but some effort to conceal it. I'm not necessarily disputing the footage. I absolutely dispute that it destroyed the tank. It could be. I've talked before about tanks. If you cover tanks with too much armour, it's just not going to move anywhere. You can't put all the armour everywhere across the whole tank. So basically, if the turret is pointing forward, so the barrel is over the front of the tank, imagine standing on top of the tank at the back of the turret, hold your arms out in a sort of V shape. That's where all the armour is. It's in the frontal 60 degrees, basically, on the front of the turret, on the front of the hull, about a third of the way back over the wheels and what have you. So it's in the front, because that's generally the bit that you point towards the enemy. You can't put the armour absolutely everywhere. And that's why we've seen so much footage of FPV drones that are not ballistic. They're not just going on a trajectory. They're not like a missile. You can guide it a little bit, but it's going down at speed. FPV drone, you can select the bit that you want to hit, and they can choose the weakest part of a tank. Now, that's not what we saw here. This FPV drone hovered. It wasn't just zooming straight in. It moved around for a bit and then decided to go and hit the strongest part of the tank. So unless it was a very inexperienced drone operator, which could well be the case, I'm very sceptical as to whether or not this either happened at all, because I think it might be staged, or if it did happen, whether or not the tank was destroyed. Very surprised. Anyway, enough about me. Francis, a lot happening on the international sphere. Where do you want to take us first?
Thanks, Dom. I said in yesterday's episode that one of the most revealing things, I think, about the Republican Party at the moment is how, despite winning their biggest electoral victory in decades and returning a former president to the White House for only the second time in American history after, that's right at home, Grover Cleveland, the Trump camp are still in campaign mode, releasing massive videos of policy announcements and making appointments with huge fanfare. That point, I think, has only been underscored by the new appointees made in the past 24 hours, easily the most controversial and radical made so far, with major implications for the world if they were to be approved by the Senate. The first is Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. She served in the US military in Iraq, served 4 terms as a Democratic congresswoman representing Hawaii, and ran for president, indeed, in the Democratic primary in 2020, before quitting the party in 22 and becoming an ardent supporter of Trump. Now, to say her foreign policy stances have been contentious and combative at times is an understatement. On Ukraine specifically, she was one of those voices who most strongly championed the story about US-funded biolabs in Ukraine spreading deadly pathogens. In a video that was posted only days after the full-scale invasion, she was accused of parroting Russian disinformation and propaganda used to try and justify their illegal invasion. And it wasn't the first time that she's been seen as overly supportive of Russian and autocratic interests. She's been particularly vocal in her support of and meetings with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, a man also wanted for war crimes, as Hamish has spoken about many times, given his professional experience in that country. Now, just to give you a flavour of the anger at the time over the Ukraine story, Senator Mitt Romney accused her of pushing a treasonous lie over that story, which just gives you a dose of the strength of feeling. Now, in an equally striking take, she once posted on social media on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I quote, "As we remember Japan's aggression in the Pacific, we need to ask ourselves this question. Is the remilitarization of Japan, which is presently underway, truly a good idea? We need to be careful that short-sighted, self-serving leaders do not end up bringing us, again, face-to-face with a remilitarized Japan." Hashtag Pearl Harbor. Now, one could make, of course, critiques of Japan, as one can with many states. For example, Japan on their legacy in the Second World War and not really publicly coming to terms with the scale of the war crimes that they committed would be one. But Japan is a transformed country in the past 80 years. It's democratic, it's friendly, and it has proved itself a vital ally of the United States in the Pacific and indeed in Europe, with the support that it has provided above and beyond for Ukraine. Then, of course, there's the AUKUS Pact, which has been put together recently, of which Japan is also involved in those conversations. So that line about the dangers of a remilitarized Japan is straight out of the Chinese propaganda playbook, which in and of itself, I think, is quite revealing. And at the moment that Britain and other countries are signing pacts like AUKUS and like those with Japan directly, that were associated with those kind of dialogues in the Pacific, it is quite extraordinary that for the Director of Intelligence you could have somebody who holds such an unusually sceptic opinion of Japan. And so I say this with honesty, that the US defence establishment should be under no illusions. If she is appointed to the post, the sharing of vital intelligence between Western partners would almost certainly be constrained, as there are many senior figures, publicly and privately, today, saying that they simply would not feel comfortable sharing certain intelligence with a country that had her as Director of National Intelligence. Some are speculating, given all that her appointment and that of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General is merely an attempt by Trump to reward loyalty, and that he knows the Senate will never approve them as the candidates. Perhaps. But even the prospect of their appointment has Russian state media cock-a-hoop this morning, calling the choices wonderful. At the same time, Fox News reports Trump may soon appoint a Ukrainian peace envoy to lead negotiations, citing multiple undisclosed sources. One saying, "You're going to see a very senior special envoy, someone with a lot of credibility, who will be given a task to find a resolution to get a peace settlement. That will happen in short order." So in that context, you can see why those who are more anxious about what Trump means for Ukraine are becoming increasingly so, despite the appointment of some of those more hawkish types in the administration earlier in the week. But again, I think it's too early to say what the real ramifications are going to be of that Trump victory. I think there will be unpredictable outcomes, put it that way, in the European context. But nonetheless, it's vital that we do continue to look at every one of these appointments and what they might tell us at this vitally important moment. Now, in other news, as Germany gears up for its own election, Chancellor Olaf Scholz is fighting for his political life. And interestingly and revealingly is doubling down on the idea here of him being the prudent chancellor who ensured peace and avoided, do you want to guess the word? Escalation. "I repeat," he said in a speech yesterday, "I'm against allowing to fire weapons supplied by us far into Russia. I won't change my position on Taurus." Now, I should say that was met by some applause in the crowd that he was addressing in the parliament and some shaking of heads. To many, it will seem simply remarkable that this notion of avoiding escalation continues to be said without irony, as it is blatantly obvious for those of us following this war so closely, and of course I include you at home in that the avoidance of escalation by the West has simply enabled Russia to continue escalation of its own, brazenly, in response to that weakness, with Iran being able to be brought in and using its weapons, and now with North Korean soldiers fighting on European soil. Now, in that context, there are reports that German MPs have privately been briefed by the Federal Civil Protection Agency that if Ukraine crumbles within the next 6 months, millions of Ukrainians would head west, a subject we've spoken about several times on the podcast. The official estimate is 10 million, 2 of them to Germany. The unofficial is up to 18 million, with 3 to 4 going to Germany. Staggering and humbling numbers, I would posit. And it is revealing, I think, of the obstinacy amongst some of the political class in Germany that there has really been no profound movement for the best part of at least 3 years from the initial first months of the invasion, where promises were made but not really delivered in the manner that was expected given the Zeitenwende that Scholz pledged. Such as things are, though, on the front line, and given that context, the big story today here in Britain is what I think will be the main focus of our episode today, which is that the Times have an exclusive story that Ukraine could develop a rudimentary nuclear bomb within months if Trump withdraws US military assistance. This is coming from a briefing paper prepared for the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So I've got, as we have, some caveats to throw in on this story, but nonetheless, let's just report it first. The Times writes, according to the report, the country would quickly be able to build a basic device from plutonium with a similar technology to that seen in 1945. Creating a simple bomb, as the US did within the framework of the Manhattan Project, would not be a difficult task, the document reads. With no time to build and run large facilities required to enrich uranium, wartime Ukraine would have to rely instead on using plutonium extracted from spent fuel rods taken from Ukraine's nuclear reactors. So that's the essence of the story. But after those reports, Kyiv very quickly put a statement out saying that Kyiv is committed to the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons. We do not possess, develop or intend to acquire them. Ukraine works closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency and is fully transparent to its monitoring, which rules out the use of nuclear materials for military purposes. Now, I know we're going to look at this report in detail in a moment, because I think there's a lot of people getting a bit carried away, frankly, with this. But the fact is, it is being talked about, and that's the story here. And I think that was intended to be the story here, with the creation of this document and its proliferation by certain entities, no doubt, in Ukraine and in the government. And we should remember, of course, that Zelensky made remarks as well, alluding to the fact that one day Ukraine would need to have nuclear weapons. But no doubt you, Dom, and Hamish have a lot of thoughts on this story, and we're going to go into greater detail. But I just wanted to give the very much top-line assessment of it.
Well, thanks, Francis. Let's stay on that last story there. I saw this report. I mean, straight away, any report that uses phrases like creating a simple atomic bomb, I don't think there's anything simple about this at all. And I see the reference to using spent nuclear fuel rods because the thought of Ukraine now being able to source all the precursor materials. I just don't believe this. I don't think it's happening. I don't even know if it's possible. But then what do I know? That's why we've got Hamish. Please do dial us in here. I don't know if it's even worth talking about, well, if Kyiv had a nuclear weapon. I don't know if we can even get that far. Is this just nonsense, this story, Hamish, or is there any realistic prospect of being able to, from a standing start, unless you've had some super duper highly top secret, tippity tip top, no one ever knows about it, process going on for the last decade, Ukraine aren't going to be able to develop a nuclear bomb in short order, are they, Hamish?
Well, let's unpack it. First of all, guys, many, many congratulations for winning pod of the year. I think it was yesterday or the day before. Absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure David will be looking down with immense satisfaction, as he should do. So fantastic effort. Brilliant stuff. Now, on to this story. You might remember about 3 weeks ago, Zelensky, I think, was at the European summit and suggested that Ukraine might need to acquire its own nuclear weapons. I think we've discussed before, Ukraine used to have about 1,700 warheads, which is about 4 times more than the UK's currently got. When it was part of the Soviet bloc, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 agreed between ourselves, UK, US and Russia, took those away from them, but Russia and ourselves guaranteed Ukraine's peace. So a little bit of an irony there. Ukraine, of course, as we know, is a nuclear power, as in power stations, has the biggest nuclear power station in Europe, Zaporizhzhia, currently under Russian control. So they have a lot of nuclear knowledge. Now, I think what one doesn't want to be too Machiavellian about this and just look at the facts. Where are they starting from, I think, is a question. If they are starting from scratch, certainly this would be a very difficult challenge. Having said that, are there still nuclear scientists around from 30 years ago? Yes, probably. Is all that information stored in some storage facility? Yes, it probably is. So number one point is, I think they're not starting from scratch. But let's look at the situation itself. The report that was published is suggesting that they would use spent plutonium-239. Yeah, that is a viable isotope to use in a nuclear device. And Fat Boy, which was the Nagasaki bomb, was a plutonium device, and a fairly straightforward one. Do they have enough of it? Yeah, they've got 7 tons of it, and they need about 6 kilos. However, the spent plutonium fuel is also has other chemicals in it, and to be a viable nuclear weapon fuel would need to be reprocessed. Ukraine currently doesn't have any reprocessing plants. There are a couple of pieces out in the media at the moment that it would take 4 or 5 years to make a reprocessing plant. There are other stories that actually they could probably do it in 4 to 6 months. And I think the report suggests that Ukraine could have a viable nuclear weapon in 4 to 6 months. So that is possible. Now, when we look at what sort of device we're talking about here, it is very unlikely they could make a viable nuclear weapon, certainly to match anything that Russia or the US has at the moment. The report suggests the yield of this device would be 1 or 2 kilotons, so 1,000 or 2,000 tons of conventional explosive. There was also a report, a chap called Dr. Lewis did a bit of a piece on Twitter X this morning in response to the Times report. He does mention a report in the 70s, a US report saying the viability of using plutonium to make a basic device. And the conclusion was, yes, you could probably do that and it would be viable. So, in theory, a small device. But what is 1,000-2,000 tons of conventional explosive? People might remember the explosion in Beirut 2 or 3 years ago when 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate went up. It's that sort of explosion, so pretty massive. I think, interestingly, in the report and other commentary coming out of Kyiv over the last few days, that the reason given is if Trump withdraws support, they'll need it in order to attack airfields. And they're saying one of these devices would take out an airfield and missiles or aircraft on it, which are attacking them at the moment. If one was being Machiavellian, one would also say that Storm Shadow, Scalp and Taurus missiles would do the same, which currently Ukraine doesn't have the permission to use outside its own borders. Just a little bit more on the device. So we're not talking about what we'd call a nuclear weapon strapped on a ballistic missile. In theory, the Ukrainians don't have a ballistic missile that could carry this device, but they certainly have missiles and they certainly have drones that they could strap it to. I think what might be viable in this area would be what we call an improvised nuclear device. In the past, Islamic State and other terror groups have tried to create these devices, but have been unable to because it's too difficult. And actually, for an improvised nuclear device, it would probably only be viable with enriched uranium. And although Ukraine has a lot of uranium for its power stations, doesn't have the ability to enrich it. Basically, uranium for nuclear power stations is enriched to about 20%. Uranium for a nuclear weapon needs to be enriched about 90%. And it is not an insignificant task turning 20% to 90%, and Ukraine would not have that ability to do at the moment. If you put all those things together, if everything works, and if Ukraine does have the sort of corporate knowledge and understanding that it used to have, it is possible that in 6 to 12 months they could produce some sort of small, in inverted commas, nuclear device based on plutonium-239, which could create a pretty massive explosion. But I sort of agree with the tone of everybody else that this is pretty highly unlikely. And actually, the story or the desire coming out of Kyiv is really probably not to create a nuclear device and everything that comes with that, but more to make sure that people like our Prime Minister and Macron and others unshackle Storm Shadow's scalp and terrorists so they can do the job which perhaps the Ukrainians envisaging that a small nuclear device could possibly do for them. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. A couple of questions for me, if I may. You're talking about the size of what might be a viable device in a few months' time. You say 2 or 3 kilotons, 2 or 3,000 tons of conventional TNT. And just for comparison, the Hiroshima bomb, 1945, was 15 kilotons. So, a fraction of that size. Firstly, what now for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty? If countries around the world see, you know what, I don't actually have to have a massive conventional force with all the cost and all the rest of it that takes. Look at North Korea. Look at how stymied Ukraine is. All I need to do is develop a nuclear bomb. So I think the longer this war goes on with the issues that we're seeing and talking about, the more the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is just being ripped up. Invite your comment on that. And secondly, when the nuclear power station at Chernobyl imploded, 86 was that? 86? In terms of the radiation, the soil and the problem of radiation, are we able to think about what kind of comparative size a nuclear bomb would have to be to produce that amount of radiation with all the decades-long problems that comes after it? Or am I not able to think of it in those terms?
Yeah, no, good questions there, Dom. Nuclear proliferation, I actually absolutely agree. The fact that it would appear that Russia is trading nuclear know-how with the Iranians and the North Koreans for manpower and weaponry is making a bit of a mockery of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But it requires for permanent members of the Security Council and the Security Council of the UN to absolutely stamp on these things. But when you've got the Russians as a permanent member and you've got these others on the Security Council, it makes life really difficult, which is why it's so important that the US and ourselves and the French are absolutely demonstrative about it and make sure that it doesn't happen. And I hope the new team in Whitehall and Westminster are onto Kyiv and saying, look, let's talk about nukes. Don't worry, we're going to come good on the Storm Shadow. When it comes to radiation, I commented for another organisation yesterday on Liz Truss's latest addition to a book, where apparently in sort of October 2022, in her short term at number 10, she spent most of it worrying about radiation and fallout from a potential nuclear blast in Ukraine, which she thought was going to happen. Seemed pretty ridiculous. When we go back to Chernobyl, I mean, that was a massive nuclear accident, and radiation did fall in North Wales, and some North Walian sheep farmers couldn't sell their sheep for 10 years. Radiation, depending what it is how harmful it is, and that's why detection and monitoring is so important. Most nuclear isotopes have a half-life, in other words, how quickly they decay. You look at Nagasaki now, had this device, you say 15 to 20 kilotons, people are now living there. So it does decay and go away. And you can, what we call, remediate buildings in the earth. I mean, it does, remediation in this case actually means digging up, taking away and putting somewhere else where it won't necessarily harm things. So the whole radiation thing is a big issue. And what I should have mentioned also, my previous piece, is the dirty bomb scenario, which again, we've heard a hell of a lot about in Ukraine, particularly from the Russians, saying that, they're going to be dirty bombs. What would be possible is if you had a load of plutonium-239 and just blew it up without creating a nuclear chain reaction explosion, you would spread a lot of radiation around, and that is what is termed a dirty bomb. But it really depends what it is and what concentration it is. I think something going off in Ukraine is not something Liz Truss should have been spending all night worrying about, because whatever radiation did reach the UK would probably be very dispersed, except for particular areas. And I, reference the sheep farmers in North Wales in the 80s and 90s would not have a huge impact. So not a really clear answer to your question, Dom, but hopefully we'll give people a bit of food for thought.
Lovely. Thanks, Hamish. Now, I'm delighted to welcome to the pod for the first time our Telegraph's Director of Audio and presenter on the Daily Tea, Kamal Ahmed. Kamal, welcome. You had a really interesting interview yesterday, I believe. But before I introduce that, I just want to say, so Polish President Andrzej Duda was speaking yesterday, and he said that Donald Trump will not allow Russia to destroy Ukraine because he, quote, does not like to lose, and because of all the US resources already invested in the country's defence. Now, those words echo that of your guest yesterday, William Hague, Lord Hague, former Foreign Secretary here in the UK, spoke to you on the Daily Tea and said that abandoning Ukraine would be a bigger humiliation for the US than the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So folks might remember Biden administration pulled US troops out of Afghanistan in August 2021 on a time frame set, I think, by Donald Trump in Trump 1. But that was the end of a 20-year war. But the operation was widely seen as utterly chaotic. The evacuation from the, or not evacuation, but the pullout from the airfield allowed the Taliban to seize power in Kabul. It was a dark day, and the argument has been made that observing this humiliation by the West emboldened Putin to bring forward his plans for Ukraine. That's all a bit of speculation. But Kamal, you were speaking to Lord Hague. How strongly was he pushing this idea that it would be a humiliation for the US? And is he just trying to sort of press the buttons that we think Donald Trump might respond to, or was this a long-held position? Welcome to the pod, Kamal.
Thanks so much, Dom. It's lovely to join you. It was a really interesting interview. As you say, Lord Hague, well known here in the UK, Foreign Secretary, as you say, in the David Cameron government at the time of the incursion or the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And he started his argument there, which was really interesting. He said that Europe should have done far more at that point to show to Vladimir Putin that incursion had to be reversed and the sanctions should have been stronger. And he said that he argued with the European Union, which of course we were still in. The UK was still in the European Union in 2014 before the 2016 referendum, which meant that the United Kingdom left the European Union. And he said in the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU, Britain, led by him, was arguing that there needed to be much stronger sanctions against Russia, that far more needed to be done to signal to Russia the determination of the EU to support Ukraine and to turn back the Russian forces. But actually, he said on the Daily Tea podcast, the interview that we did with him, that actually Germany and Italy were fighting very hard to what he described as water down the sanctions approach. And actually, in the end, the sanctions were not as tough as Britain wanted. So that's where he started. I think, Dom, he was, and I think this is genuine, he was trying to be helpful. Although he is a Conservative politician, and we, of course, in the UK now have a Labour government, it's about treating Donald Trump, who is a person who does deals, and reminding Donald Trump, who obviously has come to power under the Make America Great Again banner, that in foreign lands, the humiliation of withdrawal is a signal to the American people that America is not as great as it once was, and that its position as the world's police force is disintegrating. And I think that approach, William Hague, Lord Hague, believes, is the approach that the European Union and the UK should take with Donald Trump to encourage him to stick the course for longer. He was relatively clear that he believed that, as it's been briefed, and you, of course, have covered in great detail on this podcast, that Donald Trump thinks a deal is to be done and a line can now be drawn and Russia can stick with the territory it has already taken. William Hague said that Russia won't stop there because in the end, Russia wants Ukraine to be so denuded of resources and economic ability to rebuild that it becomes an almost non-state. Maybe a little rump is left in the west of the country, but the vast majority of the state is retaken by Russia. So that his argument was that Russia will come back for more. And of course, that Donald Trump is only there for 4 years and Russia plays the longest of long games. So I think he was trying to be helpful as a signal both to the United Kingdom Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, but also the European Union, that humiliation and loss is language that Donald Trump will understand.
Interesting. Why do you think Lord Hague feels the need to make these comments about Donald Trump? That sort of implies that everything's rosy with Joe Biden. Did he offer any comment about Biden's resolve about policy permissions and support for Ukraine? It sort of suggests that he's panicking and putting all these things in place and trying to rev up the EU and NATO and what have you for Donald Trump, as if and giving Biden a bit of a clean pass. And if I may, just one after that, you are much closer to domestic UK politics than I am. How do you think the new Keir Starmer administration here is going, in particular with regard to its support for Ukraine?
So on the issue of William Hague, to be very fair to him, we didn't ask him. We're actually interviewing about a broad number of issues. So we didn't ask him about how had Joe Biden done. We were really asking about the future and Donald Trump. So I think he only focused on that issue. He may well, Dom, agree with you about the last 4 years. He's been out of government. He resigned as a member of parliament in 2015. So he's actually been out of government for a long time. So he was only asked about Trump, and so that was what he responded to. On the second point, the problem we have here with the Labour government and Sir Keir Starmer, in particular the Prime Minister, is that he wears his principles quite lightly. This is a person that has travelled from what might be described as a hard left position only 4 or 5 years ago, supporting a different Labour leader called Jeremy Corbyn, to a much more traditional Labour position over 4 years. And he's dropped a lot of things he said he believed in only 4 years ago. So there's got to be a trust issue with Sir Keir Starmer. How consistent is he? When he says something, does he really mean it? Oddly, though, in this situation, I wrote about this in the Telegraph in my column earlier this week, because he wears his principles so lightly, he might be quite transactional. And that's what I would be encouraging him to do. And I know that Labour strategists, party strategists around him and around the UK government are trying to encourage him. I think he needs to send a big signal by upping and announcing by when the amount of our GDP that we spend on defence, hitting the target of GDP, which the Conservatives had already said they were going to do. Labour has said in principle it agrees, but it's not given us the route map to that moment. He should announce that, because then for NATO, that means that he will be seen by Donald Trump as responding to the president-elect's ask, which is Europe's got to do more by spending more money. So he'll do that first, and then if he can do that, has he got a stronger hand to play on Ukraine? I think he does believe that Ukraine should be backed, but we are in a position where it is difficult to see, if you are the government here and you have all these other pressures, which is exactly the same argument as in America on the health service and education and lack of money, how long can the European governments keep funding a conflict on the eastern borders of Europe? And I'm sure that does play in his mind. I think ultimately, Dom, if being very straightforward, if Donald Trump said, here's the deal, I think in the end, Keir Starmer is going to have to fold under it, because he is such a junior partner in this debate. And in the end, it's going to be the US's decision. And in the end, Keir Starmer is not going to fall out with America over Ukraine.
Thanks, Kamal. One point for me, if I may, just before, I know Francis would like to ask a question. You say the Labour Party have got themselves in a right old pickle here about this whole, when are they going to have the glide slope into 2.5% of GDP. I really don't know why they've allowed this to happen to themselves, because the defence budget here in the UK at the moment is about 2.32%. The reason I know that is because when the former Tory government, Conservative government, made this great old song and dance about going to 2.5%, I asked the Minister for Defence Procurement, and in fact the Defence Minister, Grant Shapps at the time, I said, why are you making such a big old song and dance about it? Because that will increase the defence budget by 0.18%. I mean, it's good money. I'm not saying we should take taxpayers' money lightly, but it's not a great hill of beans. It was a tiny percentage, but they were going on and on about this 2.5%. So Labour have inherited that. They are a smidgen. They are a sort of, a rounding error away from the 2.5%. It wouldn't be difficult for them to commit to it in this first term, bearing in mind we're only 100 and something days into the first term. I don't know why they get the politics wrong. They've done it on so many other bits and pieces as well. I just don't get it. Anyway, that's my hobby horse, but wanted to let folks know exactly where we are on our GDP here in the UK. Francis, I think you've got a question for Kamal.
Yes, please, Kamal, welcome. It's great to have you. Just staying on the Labour Party, you, as Dom said, are extremely well informed on the state of play politically within the party. And I wondered what your perspective is on how many ministers, how many MPs see Ukraine as a serious issue for their government. And what I mean is it a priority for them? When the majority happened, and it was a huge majority, it was, broadly speaking, in the campaign focused on domestic issues. Is this something that when you're having private, candid conversations with them that they bring up? And of course, we need to keep supporting Ukraine. Of course, that's the number one issue, because if it all goes wrong, then we're going to be a wartime government sort of situation. Or do you just think it's not really on the agenda as far as they're concerned because of the ideological side and the election that we've just had?
Labour is not a party comfortable with war. I think that's the first point to make. And also, just as you say, Francis, its success metrics are domestic. The health service, the economy, broader public services. Those are the issues that drive voter engagement in what governments do. I don't want to be unfair to them. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, Rachel Reeves, to an extent, the Chancellor. I think they believe what they are saying. Would they risk our relationship with the United States over Ukraine? I just don't see that happening. So I think they can be genuine in their comments, but nevertheless light on their principles, if I can put it like that, because you are absolutely right. And Dominic actually touches on the question you asked about Labour and defence and GDP. Again, Labour is not naturally pro a bigger military when in this country we have the struggles we have in the hospitals and the schools and transport, etc. Those are much easier conversations for Labour to have. Expanding the military is a tougher conversation for parties on the left, as Labour is. So I think you're right, Francis, to touch on the point that it's somewhere in between your two fashions of what is Labour actually up to here. They are genuine in their words, but I think that the depth is not going to be there. They would die on a hill around the NHS. They would die on a hill for schools. For Ukraine, I think that is a different issue.
Fascinating. Thanks, Kamal. And please don't get Francis on the subject of fashion. God knows where we'll end up. Anyway, let's go on to final thoughts now, please. Francis, what are you going to leave our listeners with today?
Well, thanks very much, Dom. I just wanted to raise a subject that's been on the minds of several listeners who've written in on this question, and especially those who share material relating to Ukraine on social media. Within 24 hours of the election, many cited a loss of a considerable number of followers on social media, sometimes a few hundred, sometimes a few thousand. And that may be because many are choosing to leave the platform. Of course, the Guardian newspaper has just announced that they will be no longer posting content on X because it's owned by Elon Musk, and they say that they think it's becoming an increasingly toxic place. But the speculation is specifically on this issue that many of those accounts were Russian bots set up to try and manipulate and defame accounts related to Ukraine subjects. Now, I'm just interested generally in what listeners make of this, and particular experts who we've had on or who have written to us in the past on Russian disinformation efforts. If you could provide your thoughts on what might be going on here, it would be much appreciated, because it's clearly something that is very much on your minds and are wondering, was it an example of how the Russian operation, as it were, was designed to do one thing, which was to operate prior to the presidential election, and then now that task is done, that they've disappeared? Or is something more complicated going on around algorithms and other things that are trying to purge spam accounts? Genuinely interested in listeners' perspectives, as we always are. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. And I'd echo that, folks. I noticed this week, since the election, I suddenly lost 200 followers, which hopefully it's all the bots and what have you. But I get spammed a load, as you see sometimes in the comments. I ignore most, mute quite a few, play with some. But yeah, I wonder if there was a load of bots in there to amplify the stuff and all the abuse that I get. So I've noticed that 200 suddenly dropped off just this week, just in the last 4 days. So I'd be very interested in your experience as well. Firstly, what you think is going on, and secondly, have you noticed that in your own accounts? Because you're in here, you're in this Ukraine space. You'll be picked up somewhere. I wonder if you've seen odd things in your accounts. Anyway, do please let us know, as Francis said. Hamish, what's your final thoughts?
I just want to pick up on your piece on the Challenger 2 earlier on, and I am writing a piece on it. So if people want full details, I'll have to look at the Telegraph tomorrow. But I absolutely agree with your assertion. I find it remarkable that one Challenger 2 is such a focus for Russian disinformation and propaganda. Over 18 months, perhaps 2 have been badly damaged. In the same time, maybe 1,500 Russian tanks have been badly damaged and destroyed. But I think it's very telling looking at it. You mentioned it was in a hull-up position. In other words, showing its all to the enemy. We as tankies know you show as little of your tank to the enemy as absolutely possible. You're in a hull-down position so that they can't acquire you. I think your point about the FPV drone is absolutely right. All the other challenges I've seen in the Ukraine theatre have some sort of reactive armour on them and have drone cages. This one appears to have none at all. And I haven't seen from the Russian bots of what the Challenger 2 looked like after the explosion. So I've come to the conclusion, and I'm sure, like as you say, all the Russian bots who follow us, I'm sure they'll give us a lot of good advice on this. To me, it just characterises the disinformation and propaganda that the Russians are throwing around all of the time. And I suppose one of our jobs is to make sure that we filter out that sort of rubbish so that people listening to the pod know what is actually happening, rather than the sort of the rather dreadful picture that the Russians are trying to paint to cover up for their war crimes and shortcomings. So that's me for today. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. I do agree. We would have seen more. We would have seen more footage if there was a Challenger 2 with its hull upside down and kit all over the place. We would have seen that. I'm sure we might see that over the next day. Who knows? But if we don't by this time tomorrow, then I think I personally am going to write it off as a fake. Kamal, delighted to have you on the pod today as our guest, as our your first time on the pod. Would you like to close today's episode with your final thoughts?
Well, look, thanks, Dom. Thanks, Francis. It's been lovely to be on Ukraine, the latest. I just hope that Keir Starmer listens to what William Hague said. I think as the former Foreign Secretary, he's someone that should be listened to. I hope that the UK can work with the EU leaders about what is the approach to Ukraine that supports that country. Show a bit of backbone. Do that. I do, though, think, as I said, that unfortunately, in the end, it will be America first. Of course, they are the major power in that theatre. And Starmer, in the end, will have to fold under whatever Trump decides he wants to do. Let's hope that the British Prime Minister is able to stiffen the American President-elect's resolve.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.